There are certain pictures that as soon as you see them, you can't help but become interested in the story behind them. That's why the old adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words, is so true. So I thought I'd show you some examples of what I mean when I say that. So here's the first example. Whenever you see that, you're automatically interested in the story behind that. Like you want to know, how does something like that happen? And so the story is that this took place in a small village in Poland, and the people in the neighborhood got tired of being run off the road by a teenage boy that had just got his license. And so when he went to sleep one night, they took a crane and put his car in the top of a tree. And so that picture tells a story that you can't help but be interested in. Here's another picture that you may have seen before. This was in 1932. Nobody knows who took the picture. Nobody knows the names of the guys in the picture, but from the perspective, they can tell that this was taken during the construction of New York City's Rockefeller Center. So if you've ever seen that, then this picture tells the story of the risk these guys took as they were building all these skyscrapers in one of the world's great cities. Here's another picture you've probably seen before. This was taken on the day Japan surrendered and concluded World War II in New York City in Times Square. Now, what's interesting about this picture, it looks like this, romantic reunion, right? But it's actually not that. The Smithsonian actually identified the woman in the picture decades later and discovered that she did not even know the guy that kissed her, which makes the story, you got a lot more questions about this story. And then there's one more that I want to show you. So this was taken, here the next one, in Germany in 1936. Now, if you know your history, Hitler and the Nazis took control of Germany, at least politically, in 1933. By 1934, they had pretty much solidified their grip on power to the point that all the opposition had sort of been eliminated. And in this picture, you see this group of men all extending the Nazi salute to the Nazi party, except for the one guy that's standing there with his arms crossed. Now, I got another picture that kind of zooms in so you can see him a little bit better. It's interesting that out of all the people in the crowd, there was one guy who decided there was at least like one line that he was not willing to cross. And so sort of as an act of silent protest, as everybody else was pledging their allegiance to this political party that had taken over his country, he stood with his arms crossed. Now, if you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to turn to Daniel chapter 3. This morning, we're in week 3 of the series that we're calling Thriving in Babylon. We're looking at the Old Testament story of Daniel, and we left off last week, 3 years after being forcibly removed from his home in Jerusalem and relocated to the capital city of Babylon. Daniel had risen through the ranks, and he had become the governor, an unlikely governor, of the entire province of Babylon. As part of his promotion to that position, he was allowed to appoint his 3 friends from back home to important positions. So at the end of Daniel chapter 2, verse 48, it says it like this: Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal courts. It's really incredible when you think about it. In just 3 short years, these 3 men, or 4 men if you include Daniel, who essentially are prisoners of war, guys who have been forced to leave home and go live in a land they never wanted to live in, have risen through the ranks, and they've now landed in these coveted positions. But then when you turn to Daniel chapter 3, the story takes an unexpected turn when Nebuchadnezzar, the ruthless king of Babylon, erects this statue, and he demands that everybody in his kingdom, everybody in his government, bow down and worship the statue as an oath of loyalty both to him and to the empire of Babylon. If you went to like VBS as a kid, you know this story. Like if there was a highlight reel of the Old Testament, this is on it. But I want you to try and listen with fresh ears today, because it may be a little bit different than what you remember. Just to set the scene, at the end of Daniel chapter 2, we read about, after having his dream interpreted by Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar humbles himself, remember this part, and he honors Daniel's God. Now, what we don't know is how much time is in between the end of Daniel chapter 2 and the beginning of Daniel chapter 3. But however long it was, something happened to Nebuchadnezzar that changed his tune. And my prediction, or what I guess, is his ego got involved. And some of you, like we've all experienced that, right? We have this moment that humbles us. We have this moment when we decide, hey, we're going to do better. And then somewhere along the line, your ego gets involved and you start to rethink that. And so as chapter 3 opens, Nebuchadnezzar takes this extraordinary step that's fueled mostly by his own ego. Look at this with me. Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. The king Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, which is 90 feet high and 90 feet wide, so this is enormous, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations of people of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of other music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Now, two things are happening simultaneously here that are both kind of two sides of the same coin. The first thing is that, like most dictators throughout history, Nebuchadnezzar is looking for a way to secure his grip on power. So he sets up this statue as kind of an oath of loyalty, and he calls all the members of his bureaucracy from all over the empire to assemble so that he'll know who's loyal and who's not. Now, if you have a hard time believing something like that could happen, I've got a picture I want to show you that shows this is actually still happening. This is a recent picture from North Korea in which a group of North Koreans are bowing before the statue of their great leader, Kim Jong-il, who's the father of the current leader, Kim Jong-un. And just so you know, if you were to travel to North Korea, there you would find statues like this all over the country that it's meant for you to bow to. Here's another example of one that's actually made of gold. So if you think this couldn't happen, it's important to understand this is still happening. The other thing that's happening, though, it connects back to the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in Daniel chapter 2. In his dreams, remember, he saw this vision, kind of this weird vision of this huge statue that had a head of gold, a chest of silver, a belly of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of clay. It spooked him out so much that he called Daniel in, and Daniel later interpreted that dream, and he said each part of that statue represents a different world empire that's going to succeed the one that came before. And he says that the head of that represents the Babylonian Empire. This head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar. But Nebuchadnezzar's not going to last forever, and there's going to be another empire, and then another, and then another. And if you remember, at first, like, Nebuchadnezzar took that in stride. But then he started to think about it, and the more he thought about it, the less he liked it. I mean, after all he'd accomplished, after this he's built this huge empire that's conquering everything around him, and he starts to think, why should somebody else be able to come in and take over what I've built? And so he decides he's going to call his strategists together, going to call his advisors together, and they're going to come up with a plan to try to push back against what Daniel says is going to happen. And so he creates this statue that's not gold, silver, and bronze and iron, but it's all gold, because all of it represents the Babylonian Empire. And so from one angle, what you see in Daniel 3 is a collision between two very different visions of the future. Daniel has described a future in which one world empire after another passes off the scene while God's kingdom continues to grow to the point that it fills the entire world. But rather than going along with that, Nebuchadnezzar is going to attempt to create a different version of the future in which there's not one world empire after another. It's just his empire, and he remains on the throne forever. So what you see is this collision between two competing worldviews. One is godly, the other is secular. It's in a sense, it's the same thing that's happening today. And so while there are people that are working really hard to expand God's kingdom, there are a lot of other people who are working just as hard, if not harder, to create a different version of the future that does not include God. That's the exact same thing that's happening here in Daniel chapter 3. And so when you get to verse 7, unsurprisingly, like as soon as the music starts, everybody in the scene bows down and worships this statue. It says, therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and people of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But then you get down to verse 8, and there's a problem. Here's the problem. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of other music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews who have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Now keep in mind, as we said last week, these astrologers are looking for a chance to eliminate Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These guys have spent their lives trying to climb the ladder. They want to be in a higher position inside that Babylonian bureaucracy. And now they've had these Jewish guys, these refugees who have showed up and have landed in the jobs that they think rightfully should be theirs. And so they've been looking for an opportunity to eliminate their rivals. And when they see that these guys have not bowed down to the statue that Nebuchadnezzar showed up, they see their opportunity. They immediately run to the king because they want the king to throw these guys in the furnace. Now look what happens next, verse 13. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, banjo, mandolin, fiddle, and all kinds of music, I added that part. If you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Look at this story. There are three things that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego happened to them as these worldviews collide. In a sense, they're the same three things that are happening in our culture. Everywhere you look as these different worldviews collide, and they can help us navigate this collision. So if you're tracking with us, here's the first thing I want you to take from the story. It's that the temptation to compromise is often intense. One of the questions that comes up when you read this story is like, where was Daniel, right? Everybody wants to know. It mentions Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but there's no mention of Daniel, and the best implication is he's somewhere else. Like he's back at the capital while this is happening on what's called the Plain of Dura. And so somehow Daniel sort of escaped the attention of Nebuchadnezzar. Now it won't stay like that forever, but his three friends have been not so lucky, and they've been called in on the carpet, and they've said, if you don't get with the program, like if you don't do what we want you to do, you're going to die an excruciating death. We're going to throw you in a furnace and we're going to burn you alive. Now you talk about like an intense challenge, an intense fear. But because of their connection to Daniel, they've been given this second opportunity. Now here's another question you might ask as you read the story. Like, Why didn't they just like cross their fingers behind their back and like bow down and just sort of go along to get along? You have to remember that Babylon was a very pluralistic society, very pluralistic culture. And what that means is it was expected that everybody who lived there would just worship like multiple gods. And so when Nebuchadnezzar says, hey, I want you to come and worship my gods and worship this idol that I've erected, he wasn't saying to them, hey, you can't, he wasn't saying you can't continue to worship your other gods. He was just saying, you need to add this to whatever other gods, whatever list of other gods that you already worship. And so for most people, this was no big deal, right? I already worship this many gods, and I can add a few more gods, and it's not going to be any big deal. It wasn't like Nebuchadnezzar was demanding that they worship his gods exclusively. He was just saying, I want you to add on to whatever else you're doing. But for a Jewish person, that was a problem. Because the Jews knew that God said, hey, I don't want you to worship any other gods but me. Don't put any other gods before me. And so you immediately recognize the problem. They serve a God who says you can only worship me, and yet they work for a king who says you have to also worship my empire and my gods if you want to survive. It's an impossible situation. And now, before you breathe a sigh of relief and say, boy, I'm glad we don't have to deal with that anymore, make sure you understand that while it might look different in 2024, the pressure to compromise is no less intense. In our culture, there are two constant sources of compromise that all of us face on an almost daily basis. The first is the whole idea of idols. And you know how this works. It might not be a 90-foot, high golden statue, but that doesn't mean we don't have our own idols that demand our attention. For some people, it's the power of a certain position. For a lot of people, it's money and control and power. For other people, it's certain possessions. It's that huge house, the new car, that impressive boat that turns heads whenever you take it out, those designer clothes. I mean, we may not like literally bow down and worship these things, but when you look at what takes most of your money and most of your attention, it'd be hard to argue that we don't have our own idols. I love the way Tim Keller said this. He said, an idol is anything more important to you than God. That covers a lot of ground. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Anything you seek to give you what only God can give. Anything that is so central and essential to your life that should you lose it, your life would feel hardly worth living is an idol. And when you think about it like that, you've got a long list of idols that are demanding your allegiance. The other thing that's prevalent in our culture are these ideologies that have become so deeply ingrained. There are certain ideologies that have become idols. Now, some are more popular than others, but all of them exert a certain level of influence. A lot of them, when you break it down, are political in nature. Things like conservatism, progressivism, nationalism, environmentalism, globalism, humanism, socialism. And those are more than just like words you hear on the evening news. For a lot of people, they've become worldviews that demand their complete allegiance. But then there are other ideologies that are more personal. Things like the transgender ideology that says a person's gender identity can be different from their physical sex. There's the whole idea of relativism that says nothing is absolutely true and you're free to choose your own truth as long as it works for you. In the church world, it's often universalism. It's the idea that everybody goes to heaven regardless of what they believed about Jesus. And the problem with all of these ideologies is that once you adopt them, once you adopt a particular set of beliefs, it becomes almost impossible for you to think critically. That's why you see things like this. That's why it's so rare for a political leader to tell the truth about their own party, even though everybody can see with their own eyes how messed up it all is. That's why it's also almost impossible to find a transgender person to speak out against the problems with gender reassignment surgery for minors. It's like whatever brand you choose, loyalty to the brand becomes more important than adhering to the truth. And you think about the situation here in Daniel 3. It's a great example of that. It's not like all these government officials didn't know this was nuts. They all knew this was an insane demand from an insecure leader. The problem was the brand that they had chosen was Babylonian. And when you're a Babylonian, like, you don't speak against the Babylonians, no matter what's true or what's not true. And so they chose their position and their livelihoods over the truth because the pressure to compromise was so intense. The second thing you see is like the temptation to compromise is intense, the consequences for refusing to compromise are often painful. So you get down to verse 16, you listen, and the king says to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he says, hey, you got one more opportunity. And they say, there is no chance that we're going to bend the knee to this statue. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you've set up. There's two things I want to make sure you notice about how they respond to the king. The first is that all throughout this story, they are courteous but firm. Like if you read through the book of Daniel, it's amazing. Here's this king, Nebuchadnezzar. Keep in mind, he's destroyed their country. He's destroyed their hometown. He's leveled the temple where they grew up. He's killed all their family and friends. And yet all throughout that, there's not one instance in the whole book where they are disrespectful toward Nebuchadnezzar. Even in this instance, over and over again, they say, Your Majesty, Your Majesty. Now, they're firm, but they're not discourteous. Now think about the way we talk about the political leaders that we don't like and compare what we do to what they did. The second thing that I want you to notice about this is that in their response, right up front, they make it clear that they don't really know whether or not they're going to survive this or not. That last phrase says, we know that God is able to deliver us, but even if he does not, opening up the door for that, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. Now, because we know the story, we think this was like an easy decision, but that's not true. Initially, when they made their decision, they made a decision in which they had no guarantee that God was going to show up. And if they had have had a guarantee, it wouldn't have been that impressive a decision. Like when you already know the outcome, you don't have to think about it too much. But it's in those moments when you don't know how it's going to turn out. And you don't know if God's going to show up. It's in those moments when the strength of your faith is revealed. I want to go back to that picture I showed you earlier. So years later, historians tracked the story of this man down. His name is August Landmasser. Now, try to wrap your mind around this. 5 years earlier, this was taken in 1936. 5 years earlier, 1931, he had joined the Nazi Party. And he began the process of working his way up in the local organization. But then in 1933, he fell madly in love with a woman named Irma Eckler. The problem was that Irma Eckler was Jewish. 2 years later, in 1935, he proposed, and when they went to get their marriage license, they were refused under some newly enacted laws that had taken effect in Germany. And Mr. Landmasser was immediately expelled from the Nazi Party, even though he'd risen to a pretty high position. In defiance of the laws, they went and they found a preacher who was willing to do sort of a secret wedding ceremony for them. So they got married anyways, and that was in 1935. And then just a few months later, about 10 months later, 1935, they welcomed a daughter into their family. That's why in 1936, as everybody else was saluting the Nazis and pledging their loyalty, there was one guy who stood there with his arms crossed. And his collision between his political ideology and his love for his family had won out. But even that's not the end of the story. A year later, 1937, he and his family were caught attempting to leave Germany. They were immediately arrested. He was incarcerated for a few months. He was charged with dishonoring the race. And in one of the last free trials before Hitler took total control, he was exonerated of the charges. But when he was let go, the judge told him, instructed him to abandon his wife and children and start over. He, of course, refused. 1938, he was arrested again, put in a concentration camp, and his wife and daughter were executed in another concentration camp. Now, the truth is, most of us are probably not going to face anything nearly as painful as what August Landmaster went through. But for you, the consequences may not be that intense, but they're no less real. I mean, a lost job, a missed promotion, a broken relationship, costly lawsuit. Depending on the stand you take, you might be canceled in public, you might be ridiculed by people you love, you might be even sued by a hostile government. You say, well, it's America, that stuff doesn't happen. I'm just telling you, as we gather here today, it's happening all over the world. There are places right now where there are certain passages of Scripture you're not allowed to read out loud. There are places you're not allowed to worship in public. See, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they had no idea how any of this was going to turn out. And yet, they chose faithfulness in spite of the consequences. They chose to adhere to the truth regardless of what was easiest for them. Check this out. Verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent, and the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. And at that point, looks like it's over. It's going to be a tragic ending to an inspirational story. But then you get to verse 24, and Nebuchadnezzar sees something or someone that he cannot make sense of. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. One last thing I want you to catch from the story. Whenever you choose conviction over compromise, God often does the unexpected. One of the things I love about this story is that up until the moment that he entered the furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, there's not even a hint that God is going to do anything. Now, they've got faith that he could, but there's no promise that he will. And so these dudes made their decision fully expecting that their lives were going to come to an end in the flames of this fiery furnace. But then, just as the moment when it looked like all hope was lost, God showed up and did something completely unexpected. And I wish I could tell you that's how it always works. I wish I could promise you, hey, if you lose your job for taking a stand, don't worry about it because you'll get another job immediately making more money. Wish I could tell you that. I wish I could tell you, hey, if you get sued for trying to do the right thing, don't worry about it. You're going to win the suit, and you're going to get a big fat, bonus for winning it. But that's not always true. There are moments when it doesn't turn out like you expected. And you've lived long enough to know that sometimes God shows up and does the impossible, and other times it's hard to see where he's at and what he's doing. But here's what I can tell you. Whenever you choose to stand on your convictions rather than compromising your belief, God often shows up. And he does things that nobody expected him to do. One of the things that sometimes trips people up whenever they read this story is that Daniel never actually identifies who that fourth person in the fire was. All the text says is that it looked like a son of the gods. And then when you get to verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar refers to him as an angel of the Lord. Now, I tend to think this was like the pre-incarnate Jesus, but wherever you land on that, here's what I know. God has a way of showing up in unexpected places and doing unexpected things in unexpected ways. That's why you never lose hope. Even when you don't know how it's going to turn out, even when it all looks bad, even when everything in front of you looks dangerous and the temptation to compromise your beliefs is so intense, you never lose hope because you don't know how God is going to show up, when God is going to show up, or what he's going to do when he finally does show up. In the New Testament, in Hebrews 10, there's this incredible passage in which the Hebrew writer tries to encourage his readers to persevere in the faith. And he says, I want you to hold to your faith unswervingly, which is like the coolest word in the New Testament. Like you should work that into a conversation tomorrow. Just use the word unswervingly. And then he tells them how to do that when you get to the end. Here's what he says. Remember those earlier days after you'd received the light, when you endured in a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times, you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. So do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. Now, he doesn't say how it's going to be rewarded. Doesn't say when it's going to be rewarded. And he doesn't say this is exactly how it's all going to play out and it's going to be easy and it's going to work out in your favor. He does not say that. But he does say you will be. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their reward was they were rescued from the flames. And if you read the rest of the chapter, they were promoted to even higher positions in the Babylonian bureaucracy. That's how it worked for them. I don't know how it's going to work for you. But the promise is that it will. I want you to stand with me just a moment. We're going to sing an old song that if you grew up going to church, you have heard before. What you probably don't know is the story behind the song. And I'm going to tell you part of this story, and you're going to think like I'm making this up, right? But when you go home, you can Google this, and you'll see I'm not. In the early 1900s, on the heels of what's called the Great Welsh Revival that took place in England, a group of missionaries traveled from Wales to northeast India to an area called Assam. They spent months there traveling among these pretty primitive tribes. They did their best to share the gospel with very little success until finally they connected with a headhunter named Knox Singh. He and his wife and his two sons all heard the gospel. They decided to put their trust in Christ, and they were publicly baptized into Christ. Now, we take all that for granted. In that part of the world at that time especially, that was a life-changing decision. When the chief of the tribe that he was a part of heard what had happened, he called all the tribe members together, and he gave Knox Singh an opportunity to publicly renounce his faith. And he said, if you want to be a part of our community, if you want to be a part of who we are, you have to let this go. You have to publicly renounce your faith, or we're going to kill you. And I can't say it in the Indian version of his dialect, but here's what he said in English. He said, I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. And the chief became so angry, so enraged at this act of defiance, that he had two of his warriors kill Knox Singh's two sons right in front of him. And then he gave him another opportunity to renounce his faith, and he refused. And then they brought his wife out, and they beheaded her right in front of him. And they gave him one final chance to renounce his faith. And here's what he said. Again, this is the English translation. The cross before me, the world behind me. Now, you've probably never heard that story, and you can Google it, but it's a story that's been handed down through several generations of Indian Christians until finally somebody translated it to English and put it to music. And in just a moment, we're going to sing it together. But the part of the story that never gets told is that almost everybody in that village, because of the faith of a guy who was willing not to compromise, including the chief that ordered his death, later became Christians. Because there's something that happens when one person chooses to stand on their convictions that does not happen when everybody takes the easy way out and just decides, hey, I'm just going to go along to get along. That doesn't work. So we're going to sing that song, and I want you to sing it like you mean it. And if you're here this morning and you've never made that decision to publicly follow Jesus, we'd love to help you do that. John's here, I'm here. Whatever you need to do, we'd be glad to pray with you, be glad to help you navigate whatever decision you need to make. But for you to do that, it's going to require some courage. So if you want to pray with somebody or talk to somebody, I'm going to ask you to leave your seat and meet us on this front row.